On the night of October 31st, 2015, the last guest checked out of the Trade Winds Motel in Tucumcari, New Mexico. The clerk turned off the neon sign that had blinked open for 55 years. The wooden doors were locked one final time. At 11:47 p.m., a real estate agent posted a sold sign near the roadside. The property would be demolished the following spring to make way for a chain gas station. Everything seemed normal. Only a few minutes later, nothing was. The motel that had once hosted families, truckers, and cross-country travelers was gone, but its story was not over. What happened? The Trade Winds was not an outlier. It was one of thousands of independently owned motels that dotted the American landscape from the 1-in-2 through the 1-in-7. These motels were born out of a simple need, a place for automobile travelers to sleep, park their car right outside the door, and move on the next morning. The concept was revolutionary. Before motels, roadside lodging meant staying in auto camps, tourist cabins, or commercial hotels in town. The motel combined the convenience of parking with the privacy of a private room. It was the first true accommodation designed for the car. The first motel in the United States is widely considered to be the Motel Inn in San Luis Obispo, California, opened on December 12, 1925. It cost $2.50 per night. The building had a distinctive Spanish mission style. Guests parked their cars under covered carports. The model spread quickly along the growing network of highways, especially Route 66, the Lincoln Highway, and the Dixie Highway. By the 1-9-3s, motels were a fixture of American travel. Owners often lived on site, running the business with family. Each motel had its own personality, architecture, and sense of place. The neon signs became icons of Americana, but the golden age of motels peaked in the 1-9-5s and 1-9-6s. The interstate highway system, authorized by the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, created new arteries for long-distance car travel. Motels mushroomed along the exits. Many offered swimming pools, air conditioning, free television, and a restaurant next door. The design was often a motor court, a U-shaped or L-shaped building surrounding a parking lot. Rooms open to the outside, guests could see their car from the bed. It was a symbol of freedom, mobility, and middle-class prosperity. At the height of the boom in 1964, there were more than 61,000 motels in the United States, according to the American Motel Association. Most were independently owned. Families invested their life savings. They competed on cleanliness, friendliness, and novelty. Some motels featured themed architecture, wigwam-shaped rooms, giant animals on the roof, or replicas of Western forts. The motel was both a place to sleep and a roadside attraction. But the forces that built the motel industry also sowed its decline. The interstate highways that brought travelers also bypassed older two-lane routes. Towns that once relied on motel traffic dried up when the new four-lane highways skirted their main streets. Motels on older alignments lost customers to newer properties built right at the highway exit. The bigger blow came from chain hotels. In 1952, the first Holiday Inn opened in Memphis, Tennessee. The chain standardized the experience: a predictable room, a reservation system, a swimming pool, and a restaurant on site. For a traveler in a hurry, the reliability of a brand name was more appealing than the uncertainty of a local motel. By 1972, Holiday Inn alone had more than 1,400 locations. The independent motel could not compete on consistency, marketing, or cost. Then came the oil crises of the 1970s. Gas prices rose sharply. Travel slowed. Many motels struggled to fill rooms. Crime also contributed. Motels with their open-air corridors and ground-floor entrances had a reputation for being less secure than locked hotels. Sensationalized media stories of crime in motel parking lots made some travelers nervous. By the 1-in-8s, the rise of budget chain motels like Motel 6, Super 8, and Days Inn put further pressure on independents. These chains offered lower prices, national advertising, and centralized reservation systems. The independent motel owner was left counting empty parking spaces. The human consequences were quiet but painful. Families who had run motels for decades sold for a fraction of what the property had been worth. Some converted their motels into permanent housing for low-income residents, which often led to further decline in maintenance and reputation. Other motels simply sat abandoned, their neon signs rusting, their windows boarded. The demolition of the Trade Winds in 2016 was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger wave. Investigators into America's motel history, if one can call them that, were not official crash investigators. They were historians, preservationists, and local community members. They looked backward and asked, what systems failed? The answer involved multiple factors. The interstate highway system rerouted traffic. The chain hotel model scaled efficiency. The economic shifts made independent operations less viable. The changing demographics of American travel: more air travel, fewer long road trips. The rise of internet booking and review sites that favored brands with marketing budgets. Each factor alone might have been manageable. Together, they formed a perfect storm. One researcher, a professor of architecture named William K. Johnson studied the decline of motels along Route 66 from 1985 to 2005. He found that 94% of the independent motels that operated in 1960 had closed by 2005. The survivors usually had some combination of location, loyal clientele, and low overhead, but they were increasingly rare. The loss was not just economic, it was cultural. The motels represented a moment in American history when travel was adventurous, personal, and local. They were places where strangers met, where families made memories, where the road itself was the destination. The story of America's old motels matters because it reveals how infrastructure, business models, and consumer behavior can reshape a landscape. It is not only about buildings. It is about the people who built them, the travelers who slept in them, and the communities that depended on them. The unanswered questions linger. Could anything have saved the independent motel? Was its decline inevitable? What might be learned for other small businesses today facing similar pressures from chain stores and online platforms? The neon signs may be dark, but the inquiry is far from over. The first segment of this podcast has only begun. In the next part, we will step back further to examine a specific case, the story of the El Vado Motel in Albuquerque, New Mexico, built in 1937, and how it survived, then nearly disappeared, then was reborn. But before that, let us understand the forces that created the motel in the first place. How could a single concept born from the automobile rise so quickly and fall so completely? The answer lies in the roads, the laws, and the choices made by millions of Americans every time they decided to stop for the night. On August 1, 1952, a new motel opened on Summer Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee. It was called Holiday Inn. The building was modest, 120 rooms arranged in a two-story motor court style with a swimming pool, a restaurant, and free parking. The owner was a businessman named Kemmons Wilson. He had been on a family road trip the year before and was frustrated by the lack of consistent, clean, and affordable lodging for families. He decided to build his own solution. The first Holiday Inn charged $4 per night. It included air conditioning, a television, and a telephone in every room. Children stayed free. The model was simple: give the traveler a predictable experience, no surprises, no guesswork. What happened next was not gradual, it was explosive. Within 5 years, Holiday Inn had grown to over 100 properties. By 1960, there were more than 500. The company used a franchising system. Local investors could build a Holiday Inn under the brand name, following strict design and service standards. The brand provided national advertising, a reservation network, and quality control. For the traveling salesman, the family on vacation, the trucker hauling freight, the Holiday Inn became the safe choice. You knew what you were getting. The independent motel, by contrast, offered a gamble. You might get a clean room with friendly owners, or you might get a dirty bed with a loud air conditioner and no ice machine. The chain removed that uncertainty. At 10 a.m. on June 29, 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 into law. It authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways, the largest public works project in American history. The goal was to connect the nation, to enable rapid movement of military equipment in case of invasion, and to boost commerce. Within a decade, the interstate system transformed American travel, but it also redrew the map of roadside lodging. The new highways bypassed the old two-lane roads, the routes that had been lined with independent motels for 30 years. Towns that had flourished as stops along Route 66, the Lincoln Highway, or the Dixie Highway suddenly found themselves off the main artery. Traffic decreased, motel occupancy dropped. The very infrastructure that created the motel boom was now choking it. By 1964, the year the Trade Winds Motel opened in Indiana, there were more than 61,000 motels in the United States. Most were independent, but the seeds of their decline had already been sown. The interstate system was not yet complete, but its effect was already visible. Along the new highways, new chain motels were being built at the exits. They had the advantage of being exactly where the travelers were. The older motels, located a few miles away on the old road, had to rely on local traffic or the occasional lost tourist. The gap widened every year. What investigators into this economic shift later discovered was a pattern of gradual but irreversible decline. Researchers from the University of Tennessee and the University of New Mexico studied the fate of independent motels along former U.S. highways. They found that between 1960 and 1980, the number of independent motels in the United States fell by nearly 40%. The decline accelerated after 1973. That was the year of the first oil crisis. On October 17, 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries proclaimed an oil embargo against the United States. Gas prices quadrupled. Americans drove less. Long road trips became a luxury many could not afford. Motels that had depended on summer vacationers saw their occupancy drop to 20% or less. Owners who had taken out loans to build or expand found themselves unable to make payments. Foreclosures became common. But the oil crisis was only the trigger. The deeper cause was structural. The The chain motel industry had perfected a business model that the independents could not match. Chains could afford to build with cheaper materials, use standardized room layouts that minimized construction costs, and negotiate bulk rates for furniture, televisions, and linens. They could also afford national advertising. A family in Ohio planning a trip to California could book a room at a Holiday Inn or a Motel 6 through a toll-free number, confident that the room would be as described. An independent motel, however charming, could not offer that certainty. The reservation system itself became a weapon. By the late 1970s, chains had centralized computer reservation networks. An independent motel, if it even had a phone number listed in a national directory, was often overlooked. Then came the second oil crisis in 1979. Gas prices again surged, travel demand collapsed. By 1980, the number of motel bankruptcies climbed to record levels. The American Motel Association, which had represented independent operators, dissolved in 1998. Its members had either closed or converted to chain franchises. The independent motel, once the backbone of roadside lodging, was now a relic. But the story was not only about economics, it was also about crime and perception. In the 1970s and 1980s, a series of high-profile crimes at motels, murders, robberies, sexual assaults made national news. The open-air corridors and ground-floor doors, once seen as a convenience, became a liability. Motels were portrayed in movies and television as seedy places where criminals hid, where drug deals happened, where prostitutes worked. The media coverage was not always accurate, but it shaped public perception. Families stopped choosing motels. Business travelers switched to hotels with interior corridors and security. The very design that had defined the motel, the direct access from parking to room, became a reason to avoid it. The human consequences were devastating for the owners. People who had invested their life savings, who had raised their children in the motel office, who had known their guests by name, were forced to sell at a loss. Some converted their motels into low-income housing, but that often meant accepting tenants who could not afford other options, leading to maintenance issues and further decline. Other motels were simply abandoned. By the 1990s, thousands of old motels stood empty along highways across the country. Their neon signs, once beacons of welcome, rusted in the sun. Their pools, once filled with laughing children, were drained and cracked. One example illustrates the pattern with grim precision. The Motel Inn in San Luis Obispo, the first motel in the United States, closed its doors in 1967. It had operated for 42 years. The building was demolished in 1971 to make way for a shopping center. The site of the birth of the American motel now holds a parking lot. The loss was not recognized until decades later, when preservationists began documenting the history of roadside architecture. By then, it was too late. Another example, the Wigwam Motel in Cave City, Kentucky, built in 1937. It featured 8 guest rooms shaped like teepees, each with a concrete base and a wooden frame. It was a classic example of novelty architecture that attracted tourists on their way to Mammoth Cave. For decades, it operated as a family business. But by the 1980s, the number of travelers stopping declined. The owners could not afford to maintain the structure. The Wigwam Motel closed in 1989. It sat abandoned for years, its teepees slowly decaying. In 2005, a local preservation group raised funds to restore it. It reopened as a museum and occasional overnight rental, but it was no longer a viable business. It had become a curiosity, a memory of a lost era. The question that haunts historians is this: could anything have saved the independent motel? The answer is complex. Some argue that the motel owners were simply outmatched by the economies of scale of the chains. Others point to changing consumer tastes. Americans in the 1970s and 1980s began to prefer the amenities of full-service hotels, room service, fitness centers, business centers. Motels could not offer those. Still others blame the highway system itself. By funneling travelers to exits with chain hotels, the interstate made independent motels invisible to the majority of potential customers. But there is another factor that is often overlooked: the shift in family dynamics. The baby boom generation, which had grown up taking road trips with their parents, began their own families in the 1970s. But by then, air travel had become more affordable. Instead of driving from Ohio to California, families began to fly. The long road trip became a memory. The motel, which had been the home away from home for the automobile traveler, lost its raison d'etre. The systems that failed were not just economic. They were also cultural and regulatory. Zoning laws in many towns made it difficult for motels to adapt. Some cities restricted the conversion of motels into permanent housing, forcing owners to keep them as transient lodging even when demand had evaporated. Tax policies favored chain hotels, which could depreciate assets more aggressively. Small business loans were harder for motel owners to obtain than for franchisees of national chains. The deck was stacked. What investigators, historians, sociologists, urban planners found when they examined the decline was a story of unintended consequences. The interstate highway system, a triumph of engineering, also destroyed the ecosystems it bypassed. The chain model, a triumph of efficiency, also erased the diversity of roadside culture. The oil crises, a geopolitical shock, accelerated a trend that was already in motion. The independent motel was a victim of progress, but progress is not always kind. Yet the story is not entirely tragic. Some motels survived. They did so by adapting, becoming extended stay properties, catering to construction workers or traveling nurses, offering weekly rates that undercut hotels. Others became boutique destinations, restored by preservationists who recognized their historical value. The El Vado Motel in Albuquerque, which we will examine later, is one such case. It survived, was abandoned, and then was reborn as a mixed-use development with a restored neon sign and a story to tell. The reason the rise and fall of America's old motels still matters is that it is a parable about change. It shows how a single innovation, the motel, can reshape a nation and how the same forces that create can also destroy. It is a reminder that the roadside landscape we take for granted is not natural. It is the result of choices made by people over time. And those choices have consequences, often unseen until decades later. In the next part, we will step into the story of the El Vado Motel, built in 1937 on Route 66 in Albuquerque. We will follow its journey from success to neglect to rebirth. We will ask, what did it take for one motel to survive when so many others did not? And what does its story tell us about the future of roadside lodging? But before that, we must understand one more crucial piece: the role of the automobile itself, and how the very car that gave birth to the motel also helped kill it. At 8 a.m. on September 23, 1975, a family of four pulled into the parking lot of the Desert Hills Motel in Needles, California. They had been driving from Phoenix to Los Angeles on Interstate 10. The father, a salesman, had remembered staying at a motel on the old Route 66 when he was a boy. He had driven off the interstate to find it. The Desert Hills Motel was still there, but it looked tired. The neon sign flickered. The pool was empty. The owner, an elderly woman named Martha, was sitting in the office. She told them she had not had a paying guest in 3 days. The family decided to stay anyway. That night, the father asked Martha why she kept the motel open. She said, "Because it's all I have." The Desert Hills Motel closed permanently in 1978. Martha moved to live with her daughter in Tucson. The building was demolished in 1998. That family's story is not unusual. It is one of thousands. Each abandoned motel had an owner, a dream, and a moment when the dream died. The cumulative effect is a landscape dotted with ghosts. Driving along any old two-lane highway today, you can see their remains: a faded sign, a boarded window, a parking lot cracked by weeds. They are evidence of a system that failed, not because of one catastrophe, but because of a slow accumulation of pressures that no single owner could withstand. The question that remains unanswered is whether the decline could have been predicted. Some economists in the 1960s did forecast that the rise of chains would drive out independence, but their warnings were ignored by owners who believed that their personal connection with guests would be enough. It was not. The system was designed for scale, and scale won. And so the motels faded, the neon signs dimmed, the swimming pools drained. The children who had splashed in them grew up and became adults who did not take road trips anymore. The culture of the open road, with its promise of adventure and discovery, was replaced by the culture of efficiency, predictability, and speed. The independent motel could not keep up. Its rise and fall is a story of America itself, a story of innovation, ambition, and the cruelty of change. We will continue this examination in the next segment with the specific case of the El Vado Motel. But for now, we are left with a final image: an old motel, its vacancy sign still glowing, though no one is there to see it. The road beyond is empty, the night is silent, and the story of what happened is written in the fading paint and the rusting metal. It is a story that asks us to remember and to understand. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on June 15, 1937, a ribbon was cut outside a newly finished motel on Central Avenue in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was called the El Vado Motel. The owner was a local businessman named Charles G.B. Wilson, who had seen the potential of Route 66 as a highway for cross-country travel. The motel featured 26 rooms arranged around a central courtyard, with a swimming pool, a cafe, and a neon sign that spelled out El Vado in bold letters. The architecture was Spanish colonial revival, with rounded doorways and red tile roofs. It was designed to attract the growing number of automobile tourists heading west. On its first night, every room was booked. The guests were families, salesmen, and adventurers, all stopping to rest before continuing their journey. For the next 3 decades, the El Vado Motel operated at near full occupancy. It was one of the most popular stops on Route 66, but by the late 1960s, something had changed. The interstate highway system was being built, and a new stretch of Interstate 40 bypassed Central Avenue. Drivers no longer had to pass the El Vado. They could go faster farther without stopping. The motel's occupancy began to drop. In 1970, Wilson sold the property to a chain operator who tried to keep it going, but the decline was already underway. By 1980, the neon sign was only lit on weekends. The pool was drained, the cafe closed. In 1985, the El Vado Motel shut its doors. What happened to the El Vado is not unique. It is a case study in the failure of a system. The system that failed was not just the business model, but the entire infrastructure of roadside commerce that had been built around the two-lane highway. When the interstate came, it siphoned traffic away. The motel could not adapt because it was designed for a specific type of traveler, one who drove slowly and stopped often. The interstate traveler wanted speed and convenience, not character. The motel's location, once its greatest asset, became its greatest liability. But the El Vado did not disappear. It sat abandoned for more than a decade. The building deteriorated, windows were broken, the roof leaked, graffiti appeared on the walls. In the late 1990s, a group of preservationists began to study the site. They recognized its historical significance as one of the few surviving examples of a classic motor court from the Route 66 era. In 2002, the El Vado Motel was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Still, no one could afford to restore it. The cost of bringing the building up to modern fire and safety codes was estimated at more than $2 million. For years, the motel remained a ghost, its neon sign a memory. Then in 2010, a developer named Tim Roberts took an interest. He had a vision, not to reopen the motel as a budget lodging, but to turn it into a mixed-use development with a restored motel, a restaurant, retail space, and event space. He applied for historic tax credits and grants. The project took years of planning and fundraising. In 2014, construction began. The original courtyard was preserved. The neon sign was restored and reinstalled. The rooms were renovated, but with modern amenities. The El Vado reopened in 2017. It is now a destination, not a roadside stop. It is a place where people come to remember what Route 66 was like, but it is no longer a motel in the traditional sense. The nightly rates are far higher than what Charles Wilson charged. The guests are not travelers passing through, but tourists seeking nostalgia. The El Vado's rebirth raises a difficult question. Is it still a motel or has it become a museum? The answer matters because the preservation of old motels often depends on turning them into something else. The original function, providing cheap, convenient lodging for automobile travelers, is no longer economically viable. The buildings survive, but the culture that created them is gone. What investigators of roadside history call adaptive reuse is the only way many motels escape demolition, but adaptive reuse changes the meaning of the place. The El Vado is now a boutique hotel. The Wigwam Motel in Cave City is a museum. The Coral Court Motel in St. Louis was demolished entirely. Each case is a different outcome, but the pattern is the same. The independent motel, as a business model, cannot compete. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the convergence of several forces. First, the interstate highway system. Second, the rise of chain hotels. Third, the oil crises of the 1970s, which made long road trips more expensive. Fourth, the shift in American vacation habits toward air travel. Fifth, the aging of the original motel owners, many of whom retired or died without successors. Sixth, the difficulty of obtaining financing for small motels in an era when lenders preferred to lend to franchises. Seventh, the changing regulatory environment, including fire codes, accessibility requirements, and tax laws that favored new construction over renovation. Each of these factors alone might not have killed the motel. Together, they were fatal. To understand the scale of the collapse, consider the numbers. In 1950, there were approximately 60,000 motels and motor courts in the United States. By 2020, that number had fallen to fewer than 15,000. Most of the survivors are chain-affiliated or have been converted to other uses. The independent, family-owned motel is now a rarity. In many small towns, the only remaining lodging is a chain hotel near the interstate exit. The old motel downtown, if it still stands, is either abandoned or used as low-income housing. Dream of the roadside entrepreneur is dead. But the story is not simply about economics, it is also about memory. The motel was a place of transition. Families stopped there on their way to somewhere else. Strangers met in the courtyard. Children played in the pool. The motel was a microcosm of American mobility. It represented freedom, adventure, and the promise of a fresh start. When the motels closed, that sense of possibility diminished. The road became a means of travel, not a journey. The stops became functional, not meaningful. At 10 a.m. on a Saturday in August 1959, a family from Chicago pulled into the Starlight Motel in Tucumcari, New Mexico. They had been driving for 2 days. The father, an accountant named Harold, had promised his children they would see the painted desert. The mother, Eleanor, was tired and wanted a shower. The clerk at the Starlight was a young woman named Betty, the owner's daughter. She gave them a room at the back near the swimming pool. The children spent the afternoon in the water. Harold sat on a plastic chair and smoked a cigarette. He told Eleanor that he loved the open road. Eleanor said she wished they had flown. That night they ate at a diner across the street. The next morning they left early. Harold never thought about the Starlight Motel again, but the memory stayed with the children. One of them, a boy named Michael, grew up to become a photographer. In the 1990s, he drove back to Tucumcari to photograph the old motels. The Starlight was still there, but it was closed. The sign was rusted. The pool was empty. He took a picture of it and later included it in a book about Route 66. He said the photograph was about his childhood, not the motel. That is the paradox of the old motels. They were never meant to be permanent. They were temporary shelters for people in motion. But over time, they became icons of a lifestyle that no longer exists. The people who loved them are growing old, the buildings are decaying, and the history is being lost piece by piece. In 2005, a historian named John Jackal wrote a book called The Motel in America. He argued that the rise and fall of the independent motel is a mirror of American individualism. The motel was a small business, owned by a family, run on a shoestring. It depended on the owner's personality, the cleanliness of the rooms, the charm of the neon sign. It was a personal enterprise. When the chains came, they offered consistency. The traveler knew exactly what they would get. That consistency was appealing, but it erased the character. Jackal wrote that the independent motel was a victim of its own success. It had been invented to serve the needs of automobile travelers, but those needs changed faster than the motels could adapt. What investigators found when they looked at the data was a pattern of delayed response. Motel owners in the 1960s and 1970s did not see the interstate as a threat. They believed that the old highways would still have traffic. They believed that loyal customers would return. They believed that their personal service would outweigh the convenience of chain hotels. They were wrong. By the time they realized the extent of the decline, it was too late to reverse. The capital needed to modernize was not available. The owners were too old to take on debt. The properties were sold or abandoned. The systems that failed were not just financial, they were also regulatory. In many states, motels were classified as transient lodging and subject to higher taxes than long-term rental properties. This made it difficult to convert a motel into an apartment building or a boarding house. Zoning laws often prohibited changes of use, so a motel that could no longer attract travelers might sit empty for years because the zoning would not allow it to become something else. This issue persists today. In some towns, abandoned motels are a blight, attracting crime and lowering property values. Cities struggle to find ways to redevelop them, but the cost of demolition is high and the legal hurdles are steep. Consider the case of the Desertaire Motel in Holbrook, Arizona. Built in 1955, it had 50 rooms and a large pool. In the 1960s, it was one of the most popular stops on Route 66. By the 1980s, it was struggling. The owner, a man named Frank, tried to keep it going by lowering rates, but he could not compete with the new chain motels near Interstate 40. In 1995, he closed the doors. The building sat empty for 10 years. In 2005, a developer bought it with plans to turn it into a senior living facility. But the zoning board denied the permit. The developer sued but lost. The Desertaire was demolished in 2007. Today, the site is a vacant lot. That is one story among thousands. Each abandoned motel has its own history, but the ending is often the same. The building is torn down or left to rot. The land is redeveloped as something else, a parking lot, a fast food restaurant, a storage facility. Memory of the motel fades. The travelers who stayed there move on. The children who swam in the pool grow old and die, and the road itself, once a symbol of freedom, becomes a scar across the landscape. At 6 p.m. on July 4, 1964, a young couple named Jim and Linda arrived at the Blue Bell Motel in Lebanon, Missouri. They were on their honeymoon, driving from Kansas City to the Ozarks. The Blue Bell was a small motor court with 12 rooms, each with a separate carport. The owner, a woman named Vera, gave them a room with a heart-shaped mirror and a bottle of champagne. Jim and Linda spent 3 nights there. They drove to the Lake of the Ozarks, went fishing, and came back each evening to the quiet of the motel. Jim said later that the Blue Bell was the best place he ever stayed. In 1972, he and Linda moved to the West Coast. They never went back. In the 1990s, Jim read an article about the decline of old motels. He tried to find the Blue Bell. It was still standing, but it had been converted into a private residence. The sign was gone. The carports were enclosed. He did not go in. He said he preferred to remember it as it was. That story captures the emotional weight of the motel's decline. These were not just buildings. They were settings for life's milestones, honeymoons, family vacations, business trips, reunions. The motel was a stage upon which ordinary Americans acted out their lives. When the motel closed, the stage was dismantled. The memories remained, but they had no physical anchor. The question that haunts this history is whether the decline could have been prevented. Some economists argue that a different regulatory approach might have helped. For example, if the interstate highway had been designed to include small business zones at every exit, the independent motels might have survived. But the interstate was built for speed, not for commerce. It was designed to bypass towns, not to serve them. That was intentional. The highway engineers wanted to move traffic efficiently. They did not consider the impact on roadside businesses. The result was a hollowing out of the small-town economy. Others argue that the motel industry could have adapted by forming cooperatives or marketing associations. In the 1960s, some independent motels joined referral groups like Best Western or Quality Courts, but these groups gradually evolved into chains themselves. The independent owners lost control. Best Western, for example, started as a referral network but later imposed uniform standards and fees. The autonomy that motel owners once enjoyed was eroded from within. Still others point to the role of the automobile itself. The motel was invented for the car. But as cars became more reliable and fuel-efficient, drivers could travel longer distances without stopping. The need for overnight lodging on secondary roads decreased. The motel was a victim of its own invention's improvement. The very technology that created the demand for motels also made that demand temporary. In the end, the rise and fall of America's old motels is a story of unintended consequences. The interstate system built to connect the nation also disconnected it from its past. The chain hotel designed to provide consistency also erased variety. The automobile, which freed Americans to travel, also imprisoned them in a landscape of sameness. The motel was a symbol of a certain kind of freedom, the freedom to stop wherever you wanted, to be surprised by a place you found on the road. That freedom is gone. In its place is the predictability of the interstate exit, the identical lobby, the same breakfast buffet from coast to coast. We will continue this story with one final case, a motel that never closed but that reveals the deeper truths about survival. But before that, consider this. At 11 p.m. on a cold December night in 1982, a truck driver named Earl pulled into the only motel still open in a small town in Oklahoma. It was the Plains Motel, built in 1950. The sign read vacancy. The office was lit. The owner, an elderly man named Roy, was still awake. Earl asked for a room. Roy gave him the key to number 7. The room was clean but worn. The heater rattled. Earl slept for 6 hours and left before dawn. He never thought about that motel again, but Roy, alone in his office, wondered how much longer he could keep going. The Plains Motel closed in 1984. Roy died the same year. The building was torn down in 1985. The site is now a wheat field. No sign remains. No one remembers. That is the silent end of thousands of motels, not with a bang but with a slow extinction. The story of the old motels is not finished, however. In the next segment, we will examine the last surviving motel of its kind, the one that somehow held on. And we will ask what kept it alive when everything else died. But first, let us understand the final piece of the puzzle, the changing family structure and the decline of the road trip itself. At 7:30 a.m. on October 17, 1973, a family of 4 from Des Moines, Iowa, loaded their station wagon and headed west toward the Rocky Mountains. The father, a high school teacher named Bill, had planned the trip for months. They would drive Route 66 as far as Albuquerque, then turn north through Colorado. They had reservations at 6 different motels, all independent, all chosen from a guidebook published the year before. The trip was meant to be a vacation, but it also served as a last chance. Bill had heard rumors that the government was about to impose gasoline rationing. He filled the tank at a station in Joplin, Missouri, and paid 36 cents a gallon. He did not know that less than 2 weeks later, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries would announce an oil embargo against the United States. He did not know that by Thanksgiving, gas prices would climb past 40 cents and stations would close on Sundays. He did not know that this would be the last long road trip his family ever took. What happened? The 1973 oil crisis changed American travel permanently. Lines at gas stations stretched for blocks. Odd-even rationing was introduced in many states. Drivers with license plates ending in an odd number could buy fuel only on odd-numbered days. The speed limit was dropped to 55 miles per hour to conserve gasoline. Long-distance driving became a chore, not a pleasure. The road trip, once a rite of passage, became a financial burden. Families stayed closer to home. They took shorter vacations. They flew if they could afford it. The independent motel, already struggling, lost a key part of its customer base. But the oil crisis was only the beginning. A deeper shift was underway in American family life. By the late 1970s, the 2-income household had become common. Both parents worked. Vacation time shrunk. Instead of 2 weeks on the road, families took long weekends. They drove to a single destination, a national park, a theme park, a beach resort, and stayed there. The motel, designed for travelers who stopped each night at a different place, was no longer relevant to this new pattern. The motel had been built for movement. Now people wanted stillness. The numbers tell the story. In 1960, the average American family took 1.7 vacations per year, each lasting about 9 days. By 1980, the average was 1.2 vacations, each lasting 6 days. The percentage of vacations that involved staying in a motel or hotel fell from 48% in 1965 to 29% in 1985. The percentage that involved flying rose from 12% to 42% over the same period. The motel was not just losing customers, it was losing an entire way of life. Consider the case of the Sunset Motel in Kingman, Arizona. Built in 1947, it had 30 rooms arranged in a U-shape around a courtyard with a swimming pool and a grill. The owner, a man named Carl, operated it with his wife and two sons. In the 1950s, they did well. The motel was on Route 66 and travelers stopped there regularly. In the summer, they were fully booked. Carl did not bother with reservations, he just turned on the vacancy sign and waited. By 1975, that had changed. The interstate had bypassed Kingman. The Sunset Motel was now 3 miles from the nearest exit. Carl tried advertising on billboards along the interstate. He offered a free breakfast and a discount for AAA members. He even installed a small playground. Nothing worked. The number of nightly guests fell from an average of 22 in 1965 to 7 in 1980. Carl could not afford to maintain the property. The pool developed a crack. He drained it and never refilled it. The sign had worn lettering. He repainted it himself, but the paint was a different shade of blue. By 1985, he was ready to sell. No buyer was interested. The Sunset Motel closed in 1987. Carl died 2 years later and the building was demolished to make way for a self-storage facility. Today, only a concrete slab remains. The Sunset Motel is a representative case, but it is not the only one. Across the country, thousands of independent motels face the same pressures. The change in family structure was compounded by the rise of air travel. In 1978, the Airline Deregulation Act was signed into law. Fares dropped. New airlines appeared. Flying became affordable for the middle class. A family that might have driven from Chicago to Florida in 2 days could now fly there in 3 hours. The motel was no longer a necessary stop along the way, it was a redundancy. But the decline of the road trip was not solely economic, it was also cultural. The romance of the open road, so celebrated in the 1950s and 1960s, faded. Americans began to associate driving with stress, traffic, and pollution. The interstate highway, once a marvel of engineering, became a source of monotony. The roadside attractions that had made the journey interesting, the giant dinosaurs, the snake farms, the mystery houses, closed one by one. The motel, which had once been part of that landscape of wonder, became just another building to pass by. Yet some motels survived. How? The answer lies in a combination of location, adaptation, and sheer stubbornness. At 10 a.m. on a Tuesday in June 2019, a woman named Carol pulled into the parking lot of the El Rancho Motel in Gallup, New Mexico. The El Rancho was built in 1937 and had hosted movie stars during the filming of westerns in the 1940s and 1950s. By 2019, it was one of the few original Route 66 motels still operating. Carol was a travel blogger. She had driven from her home in Denver specifically to stay at the El Rancho. She had read about it online. She wanted to experience the old motel culture. She booked a room in advance. She paid $90 for a night, which was more than the chain motel across the street charged. But she did not care. She wanted the history. She wanted the story. The El Rancho had survived because it became a destination in itself, not just a place to sleep. Its lobby was filled with photographs of John Wayne and Katharine Hepburn. Its rooms had names like the Ronald Reagan Suite and the Errol Flynn Room. The owners had embraced the nostalgia. They marketed the motel as a living museum. They attracted tourists who wanted to step back in time. They also benefited from Gallup's location on the historic Route 66, which had been designated a National Scenic Byway in 1995. Road trippers, especially international visitors, sought out the old route. They wanted to stay in a motel that looked like the ones in magazines. But the El Rancho is an exception. Most motels could not transform themselves into historical landmarks. Most lacked the star power or the architectural significance. The motels that survived often did so by changing their purpose entirely. Some became low-income housing. Others became halfway houses or drug rehabilitation centers. Still others were converted into storage units or retail space. A motel in Winslow, Arizona became a coffee shop and gift shop. A motel in Tucumcari, New Mexico became an RV park. The motel form was repurposed, but the original idea, the traveler's rest stop, was gone. The systems that allowed this to happen were not just economic but legal. Zoning laws, as mentioned earlier, prevented many motels from being converted to other uses. But even where conversion was allowed, the cost was often prohibitive. A motel with 50 rooms might need a new roof, new plumbing, new electrical wiring. The owners, usually elderly and without savings, could not afford the investment. They sold to developers who tore the building down and built something else. The land was often more valuable than the structure. The motel became a casualty of real estate economics. At 2 p.m. on a cloudy afternoon in August 1992, a man named Dwight stood in the parking lot of the Bel Air Motel in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was the third owner. He had bought the motel in 1985 with a loan from his father. He had run it for 7 years. Now the bank was foreclosing. The loan payments were too high. The occupancy rate was too low. The motel needed a new furnace and new carpets. Dwight could not afford either. He had tried to sell the motel, but no one would buy it. The Bel Air had been built in 1955 and had 34 rooms. By 1992, it needed renovations that would cost more than the property was worth. Dwight packed his personal belongings into a cardboard box and walked out. The motel was boarded up. It sat empty for 5 years before the city condemned it. In 1997, it was demolished. Today, the site is a parking lot for a church. What had happened to Dwight was not a failure of character. It was a failure of timing. He bought the motel in the middle of a declining market. He tried to keep it going, but he was fighting a trend that had started 20 years earlier. The Bel Air was not a bad motel. It was simply obsolete. The rooms were too small, the bathrooms were outdated, the parking lot was unpaved. No modern traveler would choose it over the Hampton Inn with its free breakfast and indoor pool. The Bel Air had no chance and Dwight had no luck. The question that remains is whether this decline was inevitable. Could anything have saved the old motels? Some argue that a collective effort like a marketing campaign for independent motels might have worked. In the 180s, a group of motel owners in the Southwest formed a loose association called Route 66 Lodging. They printed brochures and put up signs, but the effort was underfunded and short-lived. The motel owners were too independent to cooperate. They saw each other as competitors, not allies. The chain motels, by contrast, had corporate budgets and national advertising. The independent motel was a small business in an age of corporate giants. It was a craft in an age of mass production. Another approach might have been government intervention. Some towns tried to preserve their historic motels by offering tax incentives or grants, but such programs were rare and limited. The federal government had no interest in saving motels. The interstate system had been built to bypass them. The government's goal was efficiency, not preservation. The motel was an obstacle to progress. It was a relic of a slower, less productive time. The nation had moved on, yet the old motels still matter even in their absence. They matter because they represent a lost version of American life, a version in which the journey was as important as the destination, in which the road was a place of discovery, in which strangers could become friends over a cup of coffee in a motel lobby. That version of life was not perfect. It was not inclusive. Many motels refused service to black travelers. It was not always comfortable. The beds were hard and the walls were thin. But it was authentic. It was real. It was a world that people built with their own hands, not one handed down by a corporate board. At 8:15 p.m. on September 8, 2001, a woman named Eleanor sat in her car outside the Coral Court Motel in St. Louis, Missouri. The Coral Court was a famous motor court built in 1941, known for its streamlined modern architecture and its seclusion. Each room had a private garage. It was a place for lovers and for wanderers. Eleanor had grown up in St. Louis. She remembered her father driving her past the Coral Court as a child. She had always wanted to stay there. Now she was 48 years old and the motel was about to close. The land had been sold to a housing developer. The demolition date was set for October. Eleanor had booked a room for one night. She checked in. She walked to room 112. The furniture was original from the 1940s. The bedspread was worn. The air conditioner rattled. She opened the window and listened to the traffic. She slept poorly. In the morning, she took a photograph of the sign. She drove away. The Coral Court was demolished 3 weeks later. Today, a subdivision of identical houses stands on the site. Eleanor's story is the story of thousands. The old motels were not just buildings, they were repositories of memory. They held the traces of the people who had stayed there, the conversations that had taken place, the dreams that had been dreamed. When the motels were torn down, those memories became untethered. They floated in the minds of the people who had lived them. And then, when those people died, the memories died too. In the end, the rise and fall of America's old motels is a story of a nation's passage from one age to another. The motels were born in the age of the automobile and they died in the age of the interstate. They thrived in the age of the independent traveler and they vanished in the age of the corporate chain. They were a symbol of a certain kind of American freedom, the freedom to go where you wanted, to stop where you liked, to change your plans at a moment's notice. That freedom still exists, but it has been tamed. It has been standardized. It has been paved over by the same smooth asphalt that carries us from one identical exit to the next. The last surviving motels are now the exceptions. They are the ones that found a niche, the ones that became museums or that sit on scenic byways or that are owned by people who refuse to give up. They are reminders of what used to be. They are fragile, they are vulnerable, and they are precious. At 12 noon on July 15, 2023, a family from Germany pulled into the parking lot of the Wigwam Motel in Holbrook, Arizona. They had flown into Phoenix and rented a car. They had driven 3 hours to see the concrete teepees. They took photographs. They checked into one of the rooms, which was circular and small. They bought souvenirs in the gift shop. They stayed one night. The next morning, they drove east to see the petrified forest. They said the wigwam was the highlight of their trip. They did not know that the motel was nearly closed several times in the 190s. They did not know that the owner had to fight local zoning laws to keep the teepees standing. They did not know that the property was on life support for years. All they knew was that it was wonderful. And that perhaps is the only ending that matters. The old motels survive not because they are efficient, but because they are memorable. They survive because someone still wants to stop and look at them and someone still wants to tell their story. As long as that remains true, the road will never be completely empty. At 10 a.m. on a Tuesday in April 2005, a woman named Marlene walked into the office of the El Rey Motel in Tucumcari, New Mexico. She was not a guest. She was a historic preservation consultant hired by the city. The El Rey had been built in 1937, one of the earliest motor courts along Route 66. By 2005, it had been abandoned for nearly a decade. The roof sagged, the sign was rusted, the swimming pool was filled with dirt. Marlene had been asked to assess whether the motel could be restored. She spent 2 hours walking through the rooms, taking photographs and making notes. She found original tile in the bathrooms, but the plumbing was corroded. She found a neon sign that could be repaired, but the wiring was dangerous. She found a lobby with a terrazzo floor that was cracked but intact. She left with a binder full of observations. Her report estimated the restoration cost at $1.2 million. The city council reviewed the report. They decided not to proceed. The El Rey was demolished in 2008. What happened in Tucumcari was not unusual. Across the country, hundreds of historic motels were evaluated for preservation. Most were deemed too expensive to save. The cost of bringing a 1940s motel up to modern building codes often exceeded the cost of building a new hotel. The old motels were not just obsolete in design, they were obsolete in materials. Asbestos, lead paint, outdated electrical systems, and septic tanks that could not handle modern plumbing all made renovation a nightmare. Preservationists argued that the cultural value outweighed the financial cost, but cities and towns struggling with tight budgets rarely agreed. The motels were torn down and the lots were paved over for fast food restaurants or storage units. The irony is that the ones that survived often did so by accident. They were not saved by a grand plan, they were saved by inertia. A property owner who did not have the money to demolish or who refused to sell kept the motel standing out of sheer stubbornness. In some cases, the motel became a low-rent apartment building, housing people who could not afford anything better. In others, it became a storage facility for old cars or a warehouse for junk. In a few rare cases, a motivated individual bought the motel, fixed it up slowly over years, and turned it into a destination. Those are the stories that get told in travel magazines, but they are exceptions, not the rule. At 3:45 p.m. on a hot July afternoon in 2010, a man named Tom stood in front of the Blue Swallow Motel in Tucumcari, the same town that had lost the El Rey. The Blue Swallow had been built in 1956. It was famous for its blue neon sign and its vintage rooms. Tom was not the owner. He was a traveler from Ohio who had stopped to take a photo. He had heard about the Blue Swallow from a friend. He walked into the office and met the owners, a couple who had bought the motel in 2005 and had spent years restoring it. They showed him the original tile, the restored neon, the vintage furniture. Tom was impressed. He stayed the night. He wrote a review online. His review helped bring more travelers. The Blue Swallow is still open today. It is one of the few surviving motels on Route 66 that operates as a motel, not a museum. Tom's visit was a small event in a long chain of events that kept the Blue Swallow alive. But it also highlights a truth about the old motels. They survive because of individuals, not systems. The chain motels survive because of corporate efficiency. The old motels survive because someone decides to care and then someone else decides to come. It is a fragile model, but it is the only one that works. The question then is what the future holds. The old motels that remain are aging. Their owners are often elderly. Their roofs need replacing. Their plumbing needs upgrading. The travelers who remember them are also aging. Younger travelers raised on chain hotels and Airbnb often see the old motels as rundown and unsafe. They do not share the nostalgia. They want Wi-Fi and breakfast. The old motels cannot always provide those things. The survival of the old motels depends on a new generation of travelers who value authenticity over convenience. Whether that generation exists in large enough numbers is unclear. At 7 p.m. on December 31, 2023, a couple named Rachel and David checked into the El Vado Motel in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The El Vado had been built in 1937 and had been restored in 2009. It now had a mini-suite with a kitchenette, a flat-screen television, and Wi-Fi. The owners had found a way to modernize without destroying the character. Rachel and David were in their early 30s. They had driven from Denver. They had chosen the El Vado because they wanted to experience Route 66 history. They spent the evening walking around the courtyard where a small fire pit was lit. Other guests sat on Adirondack chairs talking. There was no pool, no fitness center, no restaurant, just rooms and a courtyard and a neon sign that glowed red and blue in the dark. Rachel said it was the best hotel they had ever stayed in. David agreed. That moment in a small courtyard in Albuquerque suggests that the old motels may have a second life. Not as the primary lodging option for the masses, but as a niche for people who seek something different. The rise and fall of America's old motels is not a story that ends with demolition. It is a story that continues in smaller numbers in places where the neon still flickers and the doors still open. The road is emptier than it once was, but it is not empty. And as long as there is someone willing to stop, someone willing to look, and someone willing to keep the lights on, the old motels will not disappear entirely. They will become what they always were, a reminder that the journey matters and that the best stops are the ones we find by accident.